All right, everybody, welcome to part two of the hidden bloodline of Moses. As I mentioned in the last video, we're going to look at the disappearance now of Moses' sons from the books of Joshua and Judges. Clearly, there had to have been record of this, but it was later removed. The book of Joshua chronologically follows the book of Deuteronomy, and it narrates the barbaric conquest and dividing of Palestine among the tribes of Israel. Again, this is a somewhat fabricated history, right? It's been glossed over and flavored up and, sugar and spice, everything not nice. But there is an element of truth to this, and I'll be getting into that later when we talk about the destruction of cities all across ancient Canaan around the close of the Bronze Age. There definitely was a massive decimation of cities. And this little tribe of ours here was clearly behind it. They didn't do the decimating, though. They had others do it for them, as has always been the case through history. They have other suckers do their fighting for them, turning one group of Gentiles against another. We'll talk about that later. But there is an element of truth to these stories of conquest. And yes, the Hebrews did it. Not personally. They had others do it for them and then later took credit like they did the fighting. But yeah, these battles, these conquests, they did take place. Anyway, of the 24 chapters of the book of Joshua, the first 12 describe the various phases of these conquests, whereas the next 10 are entirely dedicated to the division of the conquered territory. In these chapters, all the family lines of Israel are listed one by one, with the territories assigned to them. The family of Moses, of absolute importance to Israel, is again not mentioned at all. Yet all Israelites, even the most insignificant among them, received land. Why not Moses' sons? Why did they not receive any land? Yet we find that some of Moses' relatives did get land. For example, Hobab the Kenite, along with his descendants, got a piece of territory of the Jordan Valley near Jericho. Hobab was Zipporah's brother, and thus Moses' brother-in-law. So why was Hobab and his family, why was he and his family mentioned, but not Moses' own sons? Surely they must have gotten something, if not a major portion, right? But no mention. So the question is, was this information left out from the beginning, or was it later edited out? In either case, this information was not allowed to be handed down to posterity. Clearly, there was something to hide here. Here's yet another mysterious omission from the book of Joshua. The city of Shiloh, in the mountainous area of Ephraim, more or less in the center of the conquered territory, was set up as the most important place for the Israelites in ancient Palestine, the equivalent of what Jerusalem had later become. As we read in Joshua 18, verse 1, the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. Shiloh remained the capital of this phase of ancient Israel until it was conquered by the Philistines in the days of Samuel, right? The ancient importance of Shiloh is further confirmed in the book of Jeremiah, where this prophet, just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, depicted Yahweh as saying, quote, "Unto my place, which was in Shiloh, where I caused my name to dwell, at the first, at the beginning. Therefore will I do unto the house in Jerusalem, which is called by my name, wherein you trust, and unto the place which I gave to you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh. So clearly Shiloh was the epicenter early on, from the time of Moses up until the monarchy. Shiloh was the capital. Anyway, it's clear that at the time of the ancient Israelite conquest, the high priest, the spiritual and political leader of Israel, dwelt in Shiloh, having inherited this position clearly from Moses. So why isn't this most important fact ever mentioned? Why aren't we told who the high priest was in Shiloh, which would have been the most important figure in Israel at the time? The successor of Moses. The record is completely silent. Here we have, by indirect inference, yet another allusion to the secret society of Moses, if you will. And furthermore, why doesn't the book of Joshua mention who inherited Shiloh, this most important city to the children of Israel at this time? There's no mention of who got that territory. Conventional theologians would have us believe that Aaron's son, Eleazar, inherited Shiloh and occupied the highest religious and political position thereafter, from the time Joshua conquered Palestine. But we find no mention of Aaron's descendants or of any of the Levites specifically inheriting or occupying the city of Shiloh at all. Joshua 21 mentions the Levites who were descendants of Aaron the priest, and how they were, quote, allotted 13 towns from the tribes of Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin, and yet it mentions nothing about Shiloh being given to Aaron's line. We can certainly understand why Aaron's line would not inherit Shiloh, and that is why we find no mention thereof, even though we are told of Aaron's line inheriting other regions. Yet again, we do expect Moses' line to inherit Shiloh, but once again, not only are we not told of this, but we aren't told of Moses' family getting anything. Obviously, they would have had to have gotten something, and that something clearly would have to have been Shiloh, and yet the biblical record mentions nothing. Can you not see that this amounts to a deliberate omission? They don't mention Moses' family really at all, right? Let alone what they inherited. And no one is said to have inherited Shiloh, which was the capital. There had to be a Moses line that, in fact, inherited Shiloh, but no mention whatsoever. When we come to the book of Judges, we don't just deal with indirect inferences. Here we find instead a more direct reference to back the assertion that Moses' posterity did indeed inherit and occupy Shiloh. The expungers of the record slipped up a little here, and that's good. They left enough indications that we can put some key pieces of the puzzle together here. 2 chapters in this book, the 17th and 18th, are dedicated to a story that is apparently strange and out of the narrative context of the rest of the book. It pertains to a certain Levite, the younger son of an unknown figure, who left Bethlehem in search of his fortune and was received into the house of a man identified only as Micah. And by the way, as we talk about, things being left out and There's a fascinating hypothesis called the documentary hypothesis, which I totally subscribe to. It's very interesting. There's whole books that have been written on it. It's pretty popular among biblical scholars, critics, and fans alike, which argues for very good reason that the Old Testament appears to have been a compilation of 3 and possibly 4, some say even 5, but definitely at least 3 manuscripts that were later haphazardly and very clumsily assembled to make it one cohesive unit, but it's not cohesive at all. You can see how they cut and pasted it together in a very sloppy way. There's a bunch of overlaps. There's a bunch of parallelisms that aren't quite so parallel. And you can, by paying attention to certain key words, you can tell how this thing was mixed and matched together. And so in the process of integrating these documents, you can see where some parts were left out, other things were added that didn't belong. It's a fascinating study to get into. And so you can see how, yes, some of these important records of the Mosaic line, you can see how they would have been dropped as they were compiling these various documents. Anyway, this man, Micah, the owner of the house, lived on the mountain of Ephraim, we're told, and took on this man, or this Levite, as his own personal priest. After various adventures, the priest turned up in Dan, where he founded a sanctuary and became a priest in the service of that tribe, the tribe of Dan. Later in the narrative, Judges 18, verse 30, we find out that this unnamed Levite priest actually did have a name, Jonathan, the son of a certain Gershom. Very interesting. Apparently, the editors slipped up here and left that name in. And it's a good thing, because now we can make a connection back to Moses. Should any doubt remain, an ancient pseudepigrapha book called Of the 70 clearly reveals that this Gershom is indeed the son of Moses. Now, several generations later, so when it says son of Moses, it doesn't necessarily mean his actual direct son, but an offshoot of Moses several generations later, just like Christ is called the son of David, but he wasn't literally David's direct son. He was the great-great-great-great-great-grandson, and thus still called the son of David, right? An offshoot of David. And so that's what's going on here. He bore the same name of Gershom, but this is generations later, and yet he was a son of Moses, in the line of Moses. Anyway, this section of Judges also reveals that Gershom's sons were priests by right of birth. By right of birth. So we have the priestly line here, don't we? Just as later we had the kingly line. What line, though? Moses' line. But there's something else significant revealed in Judges 18, verse 31, that Jonathan and his sons were priests at the time that the house of God was in Shiloh, the ancient capital of Judaica. This seems to suggest that Jonathan, son of Moses, along with his sons, were connected with the house of God in Shiloh, the equivalent of Solomon's temple at the time, the headquarters, the main tabernacle or the temple, right? So here it would seem that we have a confirmation that Moses' offspring were indeed in charge of Shiloh as high priests and were part of a family line going back to Moses, and thus the real rulers, the secret rulers behind the scenes of Israel. Not behind the scenes then, but certainly behind the scenes now as far as we're concerned, because this has been hidden. Wasn't hidden from Israel then. It's been hidden from us now. The last 3 chapters of Judges, which deal with the slaughter of the Benjamites, are also striking, like the book of Joshua, for unjustifiable omissions of any reference to Moses' offspring. We have that little subtle hint dropped in, chapter 18, but then thereafter, back to complete silence again. Clearly, they, in their purge, they missed one spot, so we can see the line being traced. Judges 19, verse 1, however, does make an interesting reference to a certain Levite sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim, which is just where Shiloh was located. During a trip to his home in Bethlehem, this figure, accompanied by one of his wives, made a stopover in the city of Gibeah, where he was the object of advances by the inhabitants who were Benjamites. To get out of a fix, he handed over to them his wife, who died from the violence that she experienced, we're told. When he got home, he is said to have cut his wife's corpse into many pieces and sent them by way of messengers to all of the tribes of Israel, who were then assembled as one man unto the Lord in Mizpah, as we read about in Judges 20, verse 1. It's a pretty disgusting story. I touched on this a while back. And so it was decided to avenge this Levite, right? As a result, Benjamin's whole tribe, thousands of people, including women and children, were slaughtered, we're told. Another great heroic story, inspiring story in the not-so-holy book. Anyway, only a small group of young males was spared in order not to completely eradicate one of the 12 tribes, right? The Benjamites. Who could this Levite have been that all of Israel was gathered into the Lord in retribution for the loss of his wife's life? Why would they be willing to lose, and indeed did lose, so many soldiers for this individual? He must have been of very great importance, an offspring of Moses, no doubt. This becomes all the more obvious when we realize that the meeting place where the Israelites had gathered to make a decision about this retaliation, Mizpah, simply means high place. And since this gathering was unto the Lord, it's quite obvious that this high place unto the Lord could be nothing but Shiloh. It doesn't mention Shiloh, but what else could it have been, right? That was the high place. That was the epicenter of Judaica at the time. In fact, Shiloh is mentioned by name in Judges 21:19 in association with this same story, as is Bethel, which simply means house of God. Thus, this Levite must have been, yet again, Jonathan's father, Gershom, the son of Moses, the offspring or descendant of Moses, right? One thing is clear. Whoever took over the reins of power after Moses' death had the same ruthlessness that Moses himself did, and carried on the tradition of mass slaughter, not only of the Goyim, but any fellow, Judaites that weren't going along with the program, like Moses did, right? Moses slaughtered a bunch of Levites, not Levites, but Israelites, using the Levites to go throughout the camp with their swords and slaughter everyone that partook in the worship of the golden calf ceremony, right? While he was up on Mount Sinai. And it said, 3,000 men died that day. And Moses said, because you have done this in the service of the Lord will now pour you out a great blessing. Even though you killed even though it meant killing your brothers, friends, and neighbors, you showed your faithfulness to God, and you're going to be rewarded for that now. Moses was a ruthless guerrilla warfare tactician, and so were his descendants. Anyway, let's look at some more specific examples of Moses' tyranny so we can put into perspective how this tyranny was carried on by his offspring in later generations. Deuteronomy 7:16, and indeed that same tyrannical rage continued on all through history and continues right on up into our day. Here it is, Deuteronomy 7:16, and you shall consume all the people which the Lord your God shall deliver thee. Thine eye shall have no pity upon them. This is Moses telling the children of Israel that, what they were to do after his death. You're going to follow in this pattern. We have been wiping out our enemies, or more precisely, more in line with the historical record, you're going to get others to do your killing for you. You're going to finance it. You're going to orchestrate it from behind the scenes. You're going to incite dissension among the ranks of the Goyim, turn them against each other and slaughter them. Later, we'll take credit for it and say that we did it ourselves personally. And in a sense, they did, right? When they're the orchestrators of it. But in any case, Moses is saying that this is the pattern that was going to be followed by his offspring. His leaders would see to it that this pattern was carried out, and it was. They did consume all the people which the Lord delivered to them, and that their eyes had no pity upon any of them. Joshua, of course, beginning immediately after the time of Moses, Israel's new military leader, followed this instruction precisely. For example, Joshua 6 verses 20 and 21 says, and they took the city under the leadership of Joshua, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and ass with the edge of the sword. Just like Moses had done, right? Telling the Levites, go throughout the camp and kill young and old, little children, men and women, friends and neighbors, on and on and on and on with the sword. Joshua 11:11 says, and they smote all of the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe. Show no pity, show no mercy, Moses said, right? Joshua 11:14, but every man they smote with the edge of the sword until they had devoured them, neither left they any to breathe. Nothing was left. Clearly, someone with the exact same mentality as Moses commanded Joshua to ruthlessly exterminate anyone who stood in the way of Israel's wars of conquest, without mercy to any, young and old alike. Joshua was the military leader, but was he taking orders from someone else? Moses' offspring? The impression in the Bible is that everything fell directly into the hands of Joshua. Certainly, again, he was the military leader, right? But who was, was he taking orders from on high, from someone else? Joshua, after all, was not a high priest. There had to be a high priest, the one who gave the orders. Who was the high priest? It's not mentioned. This has always been the attitude of this little tribe and their secret societies all throughout the centuries, hasn't it? It's likely that Gershom was not known he was the real leader of Israel, but was not known or was not mentioned, or maybe he was, but later was expunged from the record. As far as the Israelites were concerned, Joshua was calling the shots. but clearly he was answering to the high priest. Moses set that up. Remember, the high priest was to, Moses said, if you have a king, the high priest is to be the real BMOC, right? The big man on campus. Interestingly enough, Gershom, another reason for expunging him from the record as the real leader, he wasn't very popular among the Israelites. After all, he had a Midianite mother, and he was born and raised among Midianites. And so the Israelites probably wouldn't have, wanted to follow him. But in the eyes of, the hierarchical structure, he was the son of Moses and the rightful heir in the priestly line. So whether they liked it or not, he was going to be their leader. So maybe they expunged it from the record for the sake of the low-level Jews. They didn't want them to know, as well as the rest of the world. Also in Numbers 12, verse 1, we find that Midian and Aaron had both revolted against Moses's Midianite or Cushite wife. Here we read, and Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman, for he had married a Cushite. So, again, Midianites or Cushites were never popular among the Israelites, and thus they never would have enjoyed being under the rulership of one of them. So there's another reason to hide this whole thing. This was one of the reasons why Moses had to create a secret society, if you will, to keep his Cushite posterity in power. Gershom was not known as the real behind-the-scenes leader of Israel until after the death of Joshua. For we're told in Judges 3, verse 8, that upon the death of Joshua, Yahweh, quote, sold them, the Israelites, into the hand of Cushan Rishathaim. And who was this Cushan Rishathaim? But Gershom himself. He was obviously a Cushite, and he was clearly someone that Israel was not happy with as a leader. Hence, the second name, Rithaim, which means from double malice. Is not this the name, is not this the same man who cut his wife into pieces and demanded a ruthless retaliation against the Benjamites? Doesn't that fit this man from double malice? In the apocryphal book of the Apocalypse of Moses, this same individual is rightly called Cushan the Terrible. It states, after the death of Joshua, Cushan the Terrible put himself at the head of the children of Israel. They didn't want, or he himself didn't want it known that he was actually the son of Moses, well, I'm sure a lot did know that, but he didn't want the Israelites to know that, there was this line of succession, that, and that this was going to carry on, and that it was going to be his half Cushite line that was going to continue on as the ruler. So, yeah, there was a secret society where they would remain in the background now and have another figure like Joshua or whatever. And that's probably another reason why they wanted a king later, right? They got the Israelites to beg for a king. So that's how they could disguise this hidden ruling power. The king now would be the one. They would go to him and complain if they didn't like the way things were going. The king would take the fall for the bad rulership of the priestly line, and the people wouldn't know that it was the priestly line actually ruling them. Seems to make sense. Why else hide it, not just from the general masses, but from the Jews themselves? Anyway, The next major figure, or high priest, or, genuine political leader, high priest, political leader behind the scenes, that oversees the house of God at Shiloh, who lived during the time of Samuel, is Eli. And guess what? We're given no genealogy for him whatsoever, not even the name of his father, for obvious reasons, right? To hide this little secret society that they were created or had created. This is particularly strange when we consider all the space that is devoted by the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, to huge begat lists for other important figures in Israel at the time. And yet, no lineage for this guy. Why was this not done for him, for Eli, who was obviously a very important figure, right? Do we not have here even more evidence of this secret society of Moses? Anyway, though Eli's family tree isn't mentioned, there's nevertheless an interesting passage that makes it clear that he was in fact a descendant of Moses. The passage in question here is 1 Samuel, is found in 1 Samuel chapter 2, where, quote, God speaks to Eli, telling him of how his father, which can mean grandfather, great-grandfather, etc., his father or forefather was in Egypt, in the house of Pharaoh. Doesn't that describe Moses? How he was chosen as God's priest to wear an ephod, to offer sacrifice, and to burn incense. Was this not Moses? Some would argue that this could apply to Aaron as well, but this makes no sense since we are not told of Aaron's line inheriting Shiloh. It only makes sense if it's talking about the unknown person who inherited Shiloh, Moses' son, right? Who passed on that heritage to future generations. Yet again, we do find Gershom and Joshua being connected with this city. In 1st and 2nd Kings, we find that the last high priest of the kingdom of Judah was Jehozadak, who was deported to Babylon while still a child by Nebuchadnezzar. He is said to have been a direct descendant of Zadok, the grandnephew of Eli, and thus the Zadokite line. I'll do a presentation on that sometime. But anyways, here we have another Moses connection. But it isn't until we come to the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles that we find any significant reference to Moses' descendants again. In 1 Chronicles 23:14-17, for example, we read this: the sons of Moses, the man of God, were counted as part of the tribe of Levi. We actually now have a reference to the sons of Moses, even though his lineage is not traced out anywhere, right? In all of the genealogies, the begat chapters. Here we see that there was a category called the sons of Moses. There was this hereditary line that was tracked, but just not kept record of. The sons of Moses, Gershom and Eleazar, the descendants of Gershom, Shubal was the first. The descendants of Eleazar, Rehabiah, he was the first. Eleazar had no other sons, but the sons of Rehabiah were very numerous, it says. Regarding Gershom, only his firstborn son, Shebuel, is mentioned here. But we know from Judges 18:31 that he had at least one other son, Jonathan. Regarding Eleazar, his first and only son, Rehabiah, is mentioned, but it is specified that he had many sons. This passage clearly provides certainty that Moses' family did indeed survive him and had descendants. It also makes it clear that Israel was well aware of this fact and did make record of it, but again, this record didn't turn up almost at all in the Old Testament. It did, but like I said, like we've been seeing here, it's very spotty. It was mostly expunged. Anyway, so we can clearly see that again, there deliberately was an aim at censoring this information from the biblical record in Joshua, Judges, as well as from Deuteronomy, where the death of Moses is recorded. Then in 1 Chronicles 26, verses 24 to 28, we read this. Shubael, or Shubuel, that I mentioned a moment ago, a descendant of Gershom, son of Moses, was the official in charge of the treasuries. His relatives, through Eleazar, Rehabiah, his son, Jeshiah, his son, Joram, his son, Zikri, his son, and Shelomith, his son. Shelomith and his relatives were in charge of all of the treasuries for the things dedicated to King David by the heads of families who were the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, and by the other army commanders. Some of the plunder taken in battle likely dedicated for the repair of the temple of the Lord, and everything dedicated by Samuel the seer and by Saul, son of Kish, Abner, son of Ner, and Joab, son of Zeruiah, and all of the other dedicated things were in the care of Shelomith and his relatives. So this treasury, the treasure that this treasurer was the overseer of, was mostly booty that was obtained through the conquests that the Israelites put others up to on their behalf. Then they would go in and clean house and steal all the goodies and walk away with all this booty and all these riches, right? Isn't that always how they've gained their wealth? Isn't that how they still gain their wealth today? Through deception, through others fighting their wars for them, like our military going into Iraq on their behalf, and not only stealing their oil for them, but raiding their museum in Baghdad while the war was raging all around them. A caravan of 3 trucks pulls up in front of the Baghdad Museum and loots the hell out of it, and then drives away. And nothing happens. It's allowed because it was, of course, an inside job, all arranged ahead of time. Bombs are going off all around. And there were these 3 trucks pulling up and looting the Baghdad Museum. That's how they've always gotten their booty, isn't it? And, of course, through their fraudulent fiat currency banking system, interest-bearing monetary system. Wow. When you step back and look at the big picture, it's pretty ugly, isn't it? But anyway, do you not see the line of Moses here? Even though you don't have a genealogical list in detail going from father to son to grandson to great-grandson, you don't have that, but you do, on occasion, have the existence of this family line popping up, indicating that it was being kept track of. There was a line of succession, a secret line of succession, mostly secret, almost entirely secret, but not secret enough. They left enough of the record intact that you can trace it. According to this last passage, there were 6 generations between Eleazar, son of Moses, and Shemelith, who lived at the time of David. This makes sense, and it also makes sense that Moses' descendants were in Jerusalem at the time of David, because that now had become the new capital, right? You got to have the priest, the real source of power, where the king's throne is, so he can answer to the priest, the real authority. Finally, we're given details of Moses' family that previous biblical books were virtually completely silent about. They didn't expunge the record thoroughly enough. But there's a problem here as well. The line of progeny stops at Shebuel, the son of Moses' firstborn son Gershom, the most important line of descent which Moses would have passed on to the priesthood and the rulership over Israel, by birthright. All that is provided is the descendancy of the younger son, Eleazar. So the cover-up still continues even into the books of the Chronicles, but yet, again, at least we have reference made to the fact that there was this line going back to Moses. When we diligently compare the genealogies, though, in the books of Kings and Chronicles, we can piece together the main figures in Moses' line through his firstborn Gershom right up until the time of the Babylonian captivity, and they play out as follows. First there was Moses, of course, then Gershom, then Shebuel, then Eli, then Phinehas, then Ahitub, then the brothers Ahimelech and Zadok from the Zadokite priestly line, and then finally Abiathar. Even though the Bible doesn't lay it out for us, we can still put it together by paying careful, close attention. Between Gershom and Zadok, there were 6 generations, and there were 7 between Zadok and Abiathar. It should be mentioned that First Chronicles also makes reference for the first time in the whole Bible to an Aaronic priestly line. However, a close examination of this list makes it clear that it is a false and indeed impossible reckoning. It apparently came about deliberately at the hand of Ezra, who, at the time of the Babylonian captivity, and for a time thereafter, was a top official among the Jews. And that's why to this day, people refer to the Aaronic line. I've done it previously in other videos just for convenience sake, because if I mentioned the Moses line, people would have said, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's the Aaron line. Again, in a sense, it doesn't matter because they're both brothers, but it really, Moses was the leading figure. So it's really the Moses line and not the Aaronic line. The fact that Ezra deliberately twisted at least some of the statements that he recorded in the books of Chronicles was recorded in the apocryphal book known as 4th Ezra, where in the 14th chapter we find Yahweh telling him, quote, "And when thou hast finished writing, some things shalt thou publish, and some things shalt thou show secretly to the wise." Ooh, isn't that interesting? So we have a clear glimpse here, portraying it as though Yahweh is saying this, but nevertheless a clear glimpse that only some of the things were to be recorded, but the rest were not to be written down, at least not for dissemination to the rest of the tribes of Israel. They were to be kept quiet, held secretly amongst the priesthood, the ones calling the shots. Or, as it's put here, the wise ones, only there to know what we would call today the rabbinate, right? The rabid rabbinate. Only they will let in on the real secrets. Just like the Vatican archives, right? Is holding all kinds of secrets that the world will probably never know unless the city was raided. and the catacombs were emptied of their volumes and opened up for the world to see. So it is with the rabbinate, folks. They have secreted away all kinds of ancient documents, all kinds of records of secrets. Can you imagine what they're holding? But we can put a good deal of it together with the scraps that have squeaked out if we pay attention. So in this apocryphal book here, we find that certain pieces of information were deliberately suppressed from the General Assembly. One of those withheld things, of course, was the knowledge of the secret society of Moses, withheld only for the scrutiny of the wise, and its whole hidden power structure, right? But Ezra had something else to hide. In chapter 10 of the book attributed to him in the Old Testament, the book of Ezra, he emphatically forbade Jews from marrying non-Jewish women to keep the Jewish bloodline pure, and claiming that this is the will of Yahweh. Yet, all the while, the top leaders of Israel, the high priests, and thus the top political leaders, were from a Cushite line of descendancy. Look at the hypocrisy there. We have intermarried. We're not pure blood, but we want you guys to remain pure. Because if you all intermarried like we're doing, then we would lose our identity. This dirty little secret could never be allowed to reach the ears of the common Jews. Never mind outsiders, the Gentiles. The common Jews couldn't know this. You see why they had to keep this secret. The hidden line of Moses was not a pure Israelite line. It was half Cushite. So they told the commoner Jews to keep their blood pure. Don't you intermarry. We'll take care of that for you. Wherever we go, we will intermarry with royal bloodlines so we can hijack them from within and use them to advance our interests and take them over from inside. But not you guys. We want you to keep the blood pure. How do you like them apples? You have any doubt now that there was this effort to hide the line of Moses? It's possible that prior to the Babylonian captivity, the Moses lineage was openly proclaimed, and that this fact was later covered up by editors like Ezra. We know some big changes were made. That's really when the Old Testament, as we now know it, was assembled. And probably most of it was written, too. There probably were scraps handed down, but it had to all be assembled. And that's why you have the documentary hypothesis, right? I think that's where it originated. There were 3 or 4 major documents that were compiled at that time. A very sloppy job was done, and a lot of omissions were made as well as additions. But that's when it first emerged in the form that we now see it today. And it's pretty much remained in that form ever since. But it dates to the Babylonian captivity. And that's why you got a lot of anachronisms in the Old Testament, right? Things that were written about before the time they were supposed to have happened. The Old Testament is loaded with that kind of crap. Why? Because it was written centuries later after the time that the things were being written about. A good deal of the Old Testament was not written contemporaneous to the time that it's supposed to be relating. That's obvious. That's undeniable. Just like what we saw in the last video, right? A description of Moses' death in the book of Deuteronomy, a book that was supposed to have been written, if not by Moses himself, at least someone who lived at the time of Moses, and yet at least that part of it couldn't have been written then. It had to have been written much later, because it goes on to say how, since the time of Moses, there has not been one in Israel so great as he. So whoever wrote that is looking back over the decades or maybe even centuries. I'll argue definitely centuries. It was probably Ezra himself that wrote that. Anyway, so as I said, it's possible that prior to the Babylonian captivity, the Moses lineage wasn't covered up, or at least, wasn't covered up to the degree that we see it covered up now in the current Old Testament that we have. and that it got covered up later from the time of Ezra on more completely. One piece of evidence of this is found in the book, the itinerary of Benjamin of Tudela, it's called, composed by Benjamin, a learned rabbi in the second half of the 12th century, written 12th century AD, written while he was on a long journey traveling around the world that put him in contact with Jewish communities abroad. In one particularly interesting account, he wrote thusly about his findings in Baghdad, in Iraq, the location of ancient Babylon, of course, where there was the, large Jewish population, and that's where Ezra had done his work of writing or compiling, the Old Testament. Here's what he said. In Baghdad, there are about 40,000 Jews, and they dwell in security, prosperity, and honor under the great Caliph. And amongst them are great sages, the heads of academies engaged in the study of the law, the Torah, right? In this city, there are 10 academies. At the head of the great academy is the chief rabbi, R. Samuel, the son of Eli. In other words, an offspring, a distant relative of Eli. Eli was his great grandfather, right? He is the head of the academy Gaon Jacob. He is a Levite and traces his lineage back to Moses, our teacher. So in the 12th century, we have an acknowledgement of a Mosaic line. He was a Levite, but he didn't trace himself back to Moses' brother Aaron. No, he traced his lineage back to Aaron's brother Moses, the real founder of the Levite priesthood. How interesting is that? Babylon is where these records were being kept, where the Jews found a safe haven, he says. Oh yeah. Since the time of Nebuchadnezzar, no doubt, they had been controlling that city. And even though it fell later to the Persians and later the Greeks, on and on and on, there still remained a strong and heavily protected Jewish population there because they ran the banking enterprise from Babylon for centuries on end. Babylon was sort of the Switzerland of the ancient world, right? Nobody touched it because that's where the money was, you see. Anyway, this seems to lend further support to the idea that the Jewish priesthood prior to the Babylonian exile was traced to Moses. Unbroken. For those that returned to Israel, the line began to be traced from Aaron, beginning with Ezra. And it really didn't matter because if you trace it to Aaron, you're tracing it to Moses, right? But again, they wanted attention off of Moses because of the impure blood thing. And also they didn't want people knowing that this was unbroken and that these were the real rulers calling the shots. It would appear that for the Jews who remained in Babylon or, Iraq, the line continued to be traced back to Moses as was originally the case. Along this same line, Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 7, section 378, made mention of a direct descendant of Moses who lived in David's time. How would he know about that? Unless records were actually being kept, right? Records that didn't make it into the Old Testament, but records nevertheless, it was still known about this line of descendancy. Here's what he wrote. The chiefs and the priests and the tribes of Levi showed great consideration in giving splendid and magnificent gifts for the building of the Temple of Jerusalem. And those who had precious stones brought them and gave them to the treasurers, of which the keeper was Jalo, a descendant of Moses. So again, here we see that there was a descendancy tracing back to Moses that was kept track of. Just didn't make it in the Old Testament. Even though we've seen reference, right? We've seen reference to Moses' descendants, but not actually tracing them out with a genealogy. So clearly, the lineage of Moses was known to Josephus in the 1st century, and we just saw a reference coming out of Iraq from the 12th century of that same line of Moses having been kept track of. Unbelievable. So such a line has existed and still obviously does exist, but no record, no accurate, publicly available record, or even available to the common Jews, has ever been published. But somebody, somewhere, does have record of that, don't they? And they've passed it on, quite obviously. Anyway, guys, this is a good place to stop. We're almost at the hour mark anyway. Again, hope you're enjoying this discussion. Lots more to come. We'll catch you in the next video. Take care.